There's a waterway in this world that no freight captain willingly enters. Not because of regulations, not because of politics, because of what the water itself does to a ship. It sits where two worlds collide, where the open ocean meets a corridor carved through mountains, where the weather doesn't just change, it attacks. Winds that accelerate through narrow passes like a pressure valve releasing. Currents that flow in three directions at once. Waves that don't roll, they stack. Engineers have studied it. Governments have warned against it. And yet, every few years, someone tries to cross it anyway. Some make it through. Some don't. The ones who survive rarely talk about it the same way twice. Because crossing this waterway doesn't just test a ship. It tests the physics of everything you think you know about how water, wind, and steel behave together, and what happens when all three turn against you at once. This is not a stretch of water that appears dangerous on a map. It looks narrow. It looks crossable. That's exactly why it keeps claiming ships. There is a place on this planet where the mountains don't just border the water. They control it. It's called the Strait of Messina, a narrow channel sitting between mainland Italy and the island of Sicily. At its tightest point, it measures just 3 kilometers wide. 3 kilometers. That's barely enough space for two large vessels to pass each other safely. But the width was never the real problem. The real problem is what happens beneath the surface. The Strait of Messina sits at the meeting point of two seas, the Tyrrhenian to the north and the Mediterranean to the south. Both bodies of water move at different temperature, different densities, different speeds, and when they collide inside this narrow mountain corridor, the result is something that has confused sailors for over 3,000 years. The ancient Greeks didn't call it a strait. They called it the home of Scylla and Charybdis, two mythological monsters said to destroy ships from both sides. Modern science eventually explained what those sailors were seeing, but understanding it didn't make it any less dangerous. The strait generates one of the strongest tidal current reversals on Earth. Every 6 hours, the entire flow of water flips direction, completely. And during that transition window, that brief, unpredictable period when the current is switching, the water surface becomes something engineers still struggle to fully model. Standing waves, rip currents forming without warning, whirlpools appearing and dissolving within minutes. One Italian maritime engineer who spent years studying the strait described it simply. He said the water here doesn't behave like water. It behaves like something with its own intentions. For centuries, small fishing vessels learned to read the strait. Local fishermen passed down the knowledge father to son. Which hours were safer, which tidal windows to avoid, which surface patterns meant a whirlpool was forming beneath. It was hard-earned, generational knowledge, and it worked for small boats. But the 20th century brought something the strait had never encountered before. Freight ships, massive, heavy, slow-to-respond steel vessels carrying thousands of tons of cargo. Ships that can't stop quickly. Ships that can't turn sharply. Ships that, once committed to a corridor, are almost impossible to redirect in time. The first serious modern incident happened in 1971. A Greek cargo freighter entered the strait during what appeared to be a calm window. The captain had checked the tidal charts. He had timed the crossing carefully. But somewhere in the middle of the channel, the current shifted early. Not by hours, by minutes. That was enough. The vessel was caught broadside by a lateral current running at nearly 7 knots. 7 knots of force hitting the full side of a loaded freight ship. The captain lost directional control almost immediately. The ship drifted toward the Sicilian coastline at a speed no tugboat nearby could counter in time. It ran aground 400 meters from ashore. No lives were lost that day, but the cargo was destroyed. The ship took 4 months to partially recover, and the maritime report filed afterward contained a line that quietly circulated among freight captains across Europe. It said, "The transit window the captain used was theoretically correct." Theoretically. That single word changed how serious sailors began treating this place. Because if a correct calculation could still end like that, what did an incorrect one look like? After the 1971 incident, maritime authorities didn't close the strait. They couldn't. It remained a legal international waterway. But they did something that revealed just how seriously they were taking the problem. They assigned it a dedicated pilotage zone, meaning no large vessel could enter the Strait of Messina without a local pilot physically aboard. Not a radio advisor, not a chart consultation, a human being standing on the bridge who had spent years learning this specific stretch of water. That requirement still exists today. But even that wasn't enough to stop what happened in 1985. A Cypriot bulk carrier, fully loaded, sitting heavy in the water, entered the strait with a certified local pilot aboard. Everything was procedurally correct. The tidal window was confirmed. Weather conditions were rated acceptable. The pilot had completed over 200 previous transits. Halfway through the crossing, a phenomenon known as a dead water effect took hold of the vessel. This is a real, documented hydrodynamic event. It occurs when a layer of fresh or low-density water sits above denser salt water. The ship's propeller begins churning through the lighter layer, generating thrust, burning fuel, producing all the right readings, but the vessel barely moves forward. It's like driving with the handbrake on, except the handbrake is invisible, and you don't realize it's engaged until you've already drifted somewhere you cannot come back from. The bulk carrier lost nearly all forward momentum in the middle of the channel. The current took it, slowly, almost gently, which somehow made it worse. The pilot radioed the harbor master in Messina with 4 words: "We have no steerage." 4 words that every maritime officer in that region knew meant one thing. The ship was now at the mercy of the strait, and the strait had never shown much mercy at all. The harbor master dispatched 2 tugboats immediately, but tugs in the Strait of Messina operate under the same conditions as every other vessel. They fight the same currents, the same unpredictable water layers, the same tidal reversal. By the time the first tug reached the drifting bulk carrier, the ship had already traveled 600 meters off its intended course. In a 3-kilometer wide channel, 600 meters is not a drift, it's a crisis. The tug crews attempted to attach tow lines to the stern. First attempt, the current snapped the approach angle. Second attempt, a surface whirlpool, small but powerful, spun the tug sideways. The third attempt succeeded, but by then, the bulk carrier's bow was angled directly toward the Calabrian coastline on the Italian mainland side. The crew aboard the carrier had done everything correctly. They hadn't panicked, they hadn't abandoned procedure, and they were still minutes away from a potential collision with the shoreline. The tug strained against the current at full engine power. The tow line held, the ship slowed. Then, almost imperceptibly, it began to respond. It took 41 minutes to bring the vessel back under directional control. 41 minutes that the pilot later described as the longest of his professional life. The carrier made it through. Damaged tow equipment, shaken crew, but intact. The incident report was thorough, clinical, professional. But buried in the appendix was a detail that didn't make headlines. The hydrographic survey conducted afterward found something unexpected. The dead water layer that had trapped the ship, it wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that season, not at that depth, not at that concentration. Something had changed in the strait's underwater chemistry, and nobody could immediately explain what. The answer came 18 months later. A joint study conducted by Italian and European oceanographers identified the source of the anomaly. Climate-driven temperature shifts in the Mediterranean were quietly altering the density balance between the 2 seas feeding the strait. The Tyrrhenian was warming faster than the lower Mediterranean basin. The temperature gap was creating stronger, less predictable density layers, exactly the kind that produced dead water events. In other words, the strait was getting more dangerous. Not dramatically, not overnight, but measurably, year by year. The researchers published their findings in a European maritime journal in 1987. The report concluded that transit risk for deep draft vessels would increase progressively if Mediterranean warming trends continued. It wasn't a dramatic warning. It was a quiet, technical, carefully worded document. But the maritime community understood its implications immediately. Several major freight operators quietly updated their internal routing policy. The Strait of Messina was reclassified in their systems from restricted transit to avoid unless operationally essential. Not forbidden, just avoided. And that distinction matters, because the strait is still open today. Local ferries still cross it dozens of times daily. Smaller vessels still navigate it with experienced pilots aboard. But the large freight ships, the ones carrying thousands of tons, the ones that can't stop or turn in time, they go around. They add hours to their journey. They burn more fuel. They accept the longer route. Because the captains who understand this waterway have all reached the same conclusion. There are places in this world where the water has already decided the outcome. Your job as a sailor isn't to challenge that. Your job is to recognize it in time. The ones who learned that lesson from a textbook made it through. The ones who had to learn it from the strait itself, not all of them got a second chance to apply it.